Hello everyone, and welcome to LSE for this very exciting event which celebrates the launch of Francis Green and David Kynaston's excellent new book, Engines of Privilege, Britain's Private School Problem. My name is Sam Friedman. I'm an associate professor in sociology here at LSE and also a commissioner at the Government Social Mobility Commission. And by way of very short introduction, I should say this is a topic very close to my own heart, not only as my own research touched on the private school problem, most recently in a study with Aaron Reeves here at LSE, showing the enduring power of Britain's most elite public schools in delivering their old boys into elite destinations. But this topic is also personally important to me. I am a private school boy myself. I attended Bristol Grammar School between the ages of 11 to 16, and actually I credit the experience as the inadvertent catalyst of my career as a sociologist. For here it was I really came to understand the profound nature of my own privilege, the advantages it would perhaps always afford me, and how fundamentally unfair that was in a society that, as a teenager, I had thought was built on the principle of equality of opportunity. Being at a private school came to define my adolescence, destroying my relationships with old primary school friends that had gone into comprehensives, causing huge arguments with my parents, who I accused of being the ultimate champagne socialists, and marking countless debates with fellow pupils seemingly unaware of Bristol's class stratification outside the cosy and leafy confines of the school. I left Bristol Grammar age 16, but my uneasiness about the experience has very much stayed with me. I like to think it's galvanized my research interests in inequality, but in truth it's also something that I think, like many people in this country, and perhaps some here tonight, particularly on the left, something that I've sort of often tried to hide, that often have felt frankly embarrassed by, and even angry about. So for all of these reasons, I was incredibly glad to read Francis and David's book, to have these and many other issues so elegantly and articulately expressed and explored and debated in the book. And I very much hope it acts to initiate a much wider national conversation about private schools, starting hopefully this evening with a lively and provocative conversation and debate. I just want to give you a very brief outline of tonight's event, and then some information about the speakers. So first, Francis and David will give an overview of the book. That will be about 35 to 40 minutes. Now, most of you, of course, already know both of them, but for those that don't, Francis Green is Professor of Work and Education Economics at UCL, and is one of the world's most revered academic experts on the economic and social effects of private schooling. And David Kynaston is one of Britain's best-known historians, currently an honorary professor at Kingston University, the author of 20 books, and someone who's been writing about private schooling journalistically and academically for the last 10 years or so. After Francis and David are finished, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Luna Glucksberg, who will give a 5 to 10 minute response. Luna is a researcher at the LSE International Inequalities Institute, an anthropologist by training, and her work focuses particularly on elites and the way they reproduce their wealth over generations. After Luna's finished, we'll open up to questions from the floor for hopefully 30 minutes or so. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Francis and David to kick us off.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for coming this evening. It feels for me a bit like a coming home. Francis and I both did our second degrees at the LSE, and actually we got to know each other playing for the LSE alumni cricket team, the Economicals, in those long-gone, high-scoring, fast-running 1980s. So it's a pleasure to be here, and as I say, thank you so much for coming this evening. So why this book? Why have we written this book? I guess two main reasons. First, we wanted to highlight the issue itself, the private school issue, and try to explain why, in our view, the existence of this flourishing private school sector in Britain stands in the way of a fairer and more effective education system, and also a fairer, more cohesive society. So that's highlighting the issue and trying to explain its importance was the first reason. The second reason was to try constructively to suggest a way forward and to put on the table various realistic proposals. And our hope would be that over the next, say, 5 or 10 years, as and when, hopefully, politicians, policymakers, whoever, even the schools themselves, actually, really decide to take this issue seriously and do something substantive about it, that our book might be, we would hope, of some use, of some relevance. It was also a book born out of frustration. The elephant in the room is a tired metaphor, but it's one inescapably we found ourselves reaching for. The reluctance, above all, I think the reluctance of, well, to some extent, the media, but above all politicians, to speak out. One politician has referred to it as a third rail issue. In other words, if you're a politician, touch it and you're dead. And at the time we were writing the book, mainly last year, among senior politicians in this country, I think it's correct to say that only Michael Gove and Andrew Adonis had ever really come out and spoken about it in any significant or substantive way. Those two brave pioneers, have now been joined by Ed Miliband, who, to our great pleasure last week, came out strongly in an article in Metro, partly in support of the book, more importantly, in support of doing something about the issue about reforming the private school system. And another senior Labour MP, but not a Corbynista, Rachel Reeves, tweeted in support. So we were very grateful for Miliband and Reeves for that support. I'll hand over to Francis in a moment, but it strikes me that it's just possible, and it would be beyond the power of any author or any politician or even any book reviewer, but the plates might be shifting in a fundamentally anti-privileged direction in this country. It's just possible. Who knows? Just possible. What we do know is that it's now de rigueur for Etonians to speak Mockney, so something might be shifting. If they are shifting, these plates, then those engines of privilege, as we call them, will inescapably be in the firing line. But as ever, only time will tell. So meanwhile, pending the plate shifting, Francis, could you drill down and tell us a bit more about the problem itself and why it matters?
So why worry about private schools? Question's been put to me on a number of occasions. There's only about 6 or 7% of children at any one time are at private schools, works out 1 in 16 pupils overall. And yet, 1 in every 7 teachers actually works in the private sector. And 1 in every 6 pounds, 1 in every 6 educational pound is spent in the private sector. So in terms of numbers, actually, they're a lot bigger than that 7% figure might first suggest. And in fact, this means that in practice, the resource gap between the private sector and the state sector per pupil is roughly a ratio of 3 to 1. Think about that for a moment, 3 to 1. It's not like, well, some schools are getting 20% or 30% more than other schools, and that might get you a little bit annoyed. It's 300% more than other schools per pupil. It's an extremely large gap. And beyond the numbers, the importance of private schools resides in the fact that they are, in effect, beacons of inequality within the education system. Having a sector with such enormous wealth and an enormous influence looming above and largely apart from the education system for the rest of the population, it seems to me affects the perspectives of all involved in the education system. Let me try to illustrate with a couple of pictures. A picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say, the yawning resource gap between the two sectors. Here's one extremely rich private school. By the way, I went to it a long time ago. But as I often discuss, what I say doesn't depend on who I am. What I say, whether it's true or not, you have to assess for what it is, not for who I am. Here's some other schools, photographs that I took from local state schools around us in Kent. Compare the one with the other. I think it's pretty clear the resource gap just in those pictures. Leave aside the 2-to-1 ratio in the numbers of teachers per pupil and so on and so forth. Now, this resource gap matters. We know now from the evidence from a number of large-scale studies that it leads to better educational results, at least as far as measured by test scores, exam results, and so on and so forth. This happens at every level. There are studies now showing that at primary school level, private school children progress more than state school children, even allowing for prior measures of ability, even allowing for their social background. They nonetheless progress modestly, but significantly more. Again, at the lower secondary level, up to GCSE, there are a couple of studies now demonstrating a modest but significant effect. And again, at the sixth form. So if you build up all these modest but significant effects, you get quite a cumulative impact of being at a private school through your childhood career. And what does that end up in? Better access to universities. And not only to universities generally, but to the more high-ranking universities. So that if you take similar children or similar people coming from families with a managerial or professional background and say, what are their chances of getting into an elite university? Let's define an elite university as a Russell Group university for the sake of this argument. Then we find that going to a private school doubles your chances of getting into an elite university for similar kinds of people. And then when you get into the labour market, you see tremendous rewards as well. They're summed up both in the question of mobility and in the question of pay. So that, for example, if you come from a relatively high status occupational background, being at a private school seriously reduces your chances of demotion down to becoming in a low status occupation. And it also gives you a pay premium. So that, well, the latest estimate is that for 25-year-olds, recently, this is like for the millennial generation, that generation that came into maturity in the 2000s, for that generation, there is estimated to be a 17% wages premium at the ages of 25 for similar children. The privately educated gets 17% more than the state-educated person. That's a big gap, and it gets bigger as life goes on. So there are big rewards, and most importantly of all, perhaps, the differences show up in positions of public influence. And here we have a picture which is due to the Sutton Trust, which studied those people who arrive at positions of public influence. In 2016, 1/3 of MPs and 1/3 of CEOs of FTSE 100 companies were privately educated. This is bearing in mind only 9% of people were ever privately educated and only 7% are going at any one time, but 1/3 of our MPs. 1/2 of our cabinet members and 1/2 of our senior civil servants are privately educated. A particular anecdote there was that when Boris Johnson resigned as Foreign Secretary a little while ago, it then became the first Conservative cabinet since 1838 in which there was not a member of Eton in the Conservative cabinet, since 1838. 3/4 of our judges and generals are privately educated. And overall, 40% of of the 500 so-called most influential people in Britain are privately educated. So there's something of a statement there about the democracy in which we live in. Now, if everybody could go to a private school and somehow the social composition of the private school was evenly spread across the population, it wouldn't matter. But in fact, alas, that's not the case. Here we have what we call the hockey stick diagram, the upside-down hockey stick diagram. It measures the participation in a private school according to your income. And you'll see that it's not until you get up into about 90% you get any appreciable proportions of people going to a private school. You'll notice that even at the lower income levels, there are people going to private school. How can that possibly happen? Well, there's two answers to that. One is family wealth, and sometimes even if you're only, say, 30-40% up the income distribution, you have saved up wealth, or your grandparents or your aunts and uncles and so on are able to fund it. The other, for a small number, is bursaries. And this is the solution that's pushed often by insiders within the sector. They say, well, it's okay, the population is much more open, population attending private schools is much more open because we have bursaries and they're increasing and so on and so forth. Well, we've looked at the figures, we've examined official figures, official data on the dispensement of bursaries and so on, and they go like this. 4% of the total turnover of bursaries, 4% goes into bursaries. And only 1% of the children of private schools actually go free. And that hasn't changed over the years. So despite the good intentions of many private school heads and many private school teachers who are themselves worried about this social composition, they've not been able to make changes over the years. So what's the problem with all of this? In our view, there's three main aspects to that problem. The first we're calling systemic inefficiency. What do we mean by that? First of all, having our educational resources so unequally distributed is not only unfair, it's very inefficient. So that if one school's already got, say, 20 playing fields, and another school's got one playing field, and you say, where is the best place to put another playing field? Well, if you give the one that's already got 20 and make it 21, they could possibly make use of it, but not much value to that. If you give it to the school that's only got one and double it, then you make a lot more use of it. So equality is efficient in that sense. Another way in which the very unequal distribution is inefficient is through what we call the sheer extravagance of these schools. Incredible amounts of money have been spent on these schools in the last 20 years. Recently, someone I know who was a member of an acting troupe was going along to give a performance in one of the private schools within Kent. And he arrived with his troupe of actors at the gates of the school and said, please would you tell us where the theatre is? And the response was, which theatre would you like to go to, sir? And indeed it's been pointed out that within the private schools in London there are 59 theatres. That compares with actually 42 in London's West End. I like most of all the comment of one journalist named Ben Chu, writing in The Independent a couple of years ago, who, looking at what some of the private schools has become, and said, wow, they're basically country clubs with schools attached to them. Well, that's not all there is to the inefficiency. There's also the argument about the positional effect of private schooling. Because part of what the money spent on private schooling does is not just give you a good education, but it also moves you up the ranks. So if something is particularly ranked, like, say, access to Oxford or Cambridge universities, or to particularly scarce jobs in the City of London or so on, if they're ranked and you push one group further up, it's pretty good for that group that gets pushed further up. But the ones that don't get in or have their chances reduced of getting in, they get put further down. So to that extent, the education is of a private value, but not, of course, of any social value if you take the whole population. So in all those ways, we think that private schools, heavy spending on the private schools is inefficient. Moving on to the second bullet point there, the democratic deficit. In a way, that's kind of more obvious. looking at that Sutton Trust diagram we had up a few moments ago, the concentration in positions of public influence. The privileged and entitled products of an elite private education have only, we would argue, a limited and partial understanding of and empathy with the realities of everyday life as lived by most people. So, indeed, it marked some kind of apotheosis when, in July 2014, the appointment of Nicky Morgan as the Education Secretary meant that every single minister in the Education Department was privately educated, supposed to be running the state education system. What is the defence of that? Well, the ex-educational correspondent for the Financial Times, one David Turner, wrote an interesting book about private schools 2 or 3 years ago, more or less in their defence, and he assures us that that's okay. It doesn't matter that these positions of influence in our society are monopolised or disproportionately occupied by private school alumni, because, he said, David Cameron and other Eton boys were given a good political education at a school with a long tradition of educating politicians. I leave you with just that there. I think the argument stands. Fundamentally, of course, though, it's to do with fairness. And I'm going to give you a quotation some of you may have seen before. In 2014, Alan Bennett, well-known playwright, gave a sermon in Cambridge in King's College, and amongst other things he said what you see there. Private education is not fair. Those who provide it know it. Those who pay for it know it. Those who have to sacrifice in order to purchase it know it. And those who receive it know it, or should. And if their education ends without it dawning on them, then that education has been wasted. Well, you might say that's just one man's opinion, but in order to see whether the unfairness was a general perception or not, we commissioned a poll from Populace and put to a representative sample of the British population the following question, asking whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement where you see it there in front of you, it is unfair that some people with a lot of money get a better education and life chances for their children by paying for a private school. And I'm now going to give you the answers that came out of there. We see that 63% agreed with that proposition, and actually more people strongly agreed with it than slightly agreed with it. 19% were neutral or answered don't know. 18% either slightly or strongly disagreed with that proposition. So it's pretty obvious there, I think, that there's a slice of the population, a large majority of the population, that would agree with Alan Bennett that the private school system is unfair. So I'm now going to pass it back to David, because the question is, what's been the response to it over the ages of our politicians to this problem of unfairness?
Thank you, Francis. Well, in a word, I think pretty disappointing. The problem has not gone entirely unnoticed over the last century or so. But on the whole, it's been a story of political inaction. A very quick whistle-stop tour now. There are two crucial decades in the story, the 1940s and the 1960s. The 1940s, for obvious reasons, the war and the immediate aftermath of war, was the decade par excellence in 20th century Britain, when potentially everything was up for grabs. The schools themselves, the private schools themselves, were, or public schools as they were known then, for some reason helpful to them, lost in the mists of time, but we can talk about it in the discussion afterwards. Were on the whole called them private, but public if necessary. They were fearful of what might happen to them in the 1940s. There were two key people and moments. People, on the left there, Rab Butler, Conservative, in charge of education towards the end of the war. The person who created the great 1944 Education Act that opened up secondary education for everybody. a genuinely pioneering and reforming act, and it was his baby. But he deliberately excluded private schools from the act. Instead, he deliberately shunted into the sidings what he afterwards called the first-class carriages. He played a blinder, actually, tactically speaking, but it meant that at that point when the national education system was being reshaped, the private schools were just pushed quietly to one side. He was a reform-minded man, but it had its limits. And I think also, perhaps tribally speaking, as a conservative at that time, and this is actually arguably applicable still up to the present day, reform had its limits, tribally speaking, not wanting to be seen as, in that favourite word of that time, unsound. And then after the war, the great reforming Labour government following the 1945 landslide election, led by Clement Attlee, in the centre there with the moustache. And it was said of Attlee that apart from politics, he only really had two interests in life. One was cricket, and the other was Haileybury. And Haileybury was the private school where he'd been educated. And it was on the agenda, the possibility of doing something reasonably dramatic with the private schools, but he personally blocked it. But it wasn't just down to Attlee. It was also, there was this view expressed by his first education minister immediately after the war, Ellen Wilkinson. Ellen Wilkinson had been a great radical Labour figure of the 1930s. And she told her party in 1946 that the solution was to make the schools provided by the state, quote, so good and varied that it would seem, quote, quite absurd to send children to the public schools or to the private schools. To make the state schools so good, so varied, that it would be absurd to want to send your children to the fee-paying schools. Well, it was a noble aspiration. It remains a noble aspiration, but 73 years on, that's what it remains, a noble aspiration. So, ultimately, nothing of substance happened in the 1940s. The 1960s, the key figure is Anthony Crosland there, bottom right, one of the really most fascinating men in post-war British political history. In 1956, he wrote The Future of Socialism, the cardinal text for many, many years of democratic socialism. And he referred to the fee-paying sector as, quote, much the most flagrant inequality of opportunity, as it is cause of class inequality generally in our educational system. And he then went straight on with a much quoted sentence. He went on, I have never been able to understand why socialists have been so obsessed with the question of the grammar schools and so indifferent to the much more glaring injustice of the independent schools. Well, 10 years later or so, decade later, in the mid-60s, he was Education Secretary, and we all know what happened. On the one hand, action was taken to start to virtually end the grammar schools, whether rightly or wrongly is a separate question. So to virtually end the grammar schools, and not a glove was laid on the private schools, not a glove, despite Crosland in 1956 having declared that was where socialists should concentrate their energies, not on the grammar school question. Why did Crosland fail to lay a glove? Well, it's a complicated story, and there are several reasons, but I think it was ultimately because, A, Crosland's libertarianism trumped his egalitarianism, and B, a certain sense of fatalism. He lost faith in the ability to do anything substantive. He saw it as too difficult, too complex a question. That feebleness culminated in what really was the hopeless flop of the Public Schools Commission that Crosland had set up. The Commission reported in July 1968 and absolutely led to nowhere. And here we come to cartoon time. And this cartoon appeared in The Guardian on July the 25th, 1968, amidst various letters in the correspondence pages in the immediate aftermath of the Commission's report. July the 25th, 1968, a rather angry-looking man, sir, with reference to your leader on the public school system's divisive influence on our society, ... And the killer, of course, is the date on the calendar above him, 25th of July, 2068, exactly 100 years later. In other words, with the implication that nothing will have changed 100 years on. Well, last year was when Francis and I were mainly writing this book, 2018, and it was hard not to be aware that we were exactly halfway between 1968 and 2068. Indeed, now, 2019, we're actually slightly nearer to 2068, and we haven't got a whole lot further. Very briefly, what's happened since the 1960s in terms of action, some flickers of action, and I'll mention four very briefly. In the early 70s, Roy Hattersley, when he was Labour's Shadow Education Secretary, did talk of abolition, but that was rapidly quashed by his party leader, Harold Wilson, who accused Hattersley of having got, quote, religion. So that went. Secondly, in the Thatcher Major era, 1980s and 90s, there was the assisted places scheme. It didn't result in very much positive. Entry was determined by the schools, and the scheme was ruthlessly gamed by the middle class and their accountants. So in terms of changing the social composition of the schools, it really didn't make much difference. Then moving to New Labour, that basically, broadly speaking, shied away from the issue. It did bring in a Charities Act in 2006, and that was laying down how recipients of charitable status, including the private schools, would need to demonstrate public benefit. But the demands imposed on the schools in terms of demonstrating public benefit were very much watered down. They were pretty soft and didn't really go anywhere. And there's no doubt that Tony Blair, as Labour leader, had absolutely no interest in taking on the private schools. And then lastly, where we are now politically. As far as the Conservatives are concerned, Theresa May made so much after coming to power in 2016 of the great meritocracy and so on. But now it's pretty feeble from the Tories. They pin their hopes on partnerships, i.e. partnerships between private and state schools, but it's very much on a voluntary, largely unaccountable basis, and doesn't really seem to make a significant difference, especially in terms of any redistribution of resources. It's minute compared with that fundamental, glaring 3-to-1 inequality in resources as a whole. As for Labour, 2017 manifesto, they did put forward charging VAT on school fees. Not an insignificant suggestion at all, actually, in order to pay for free school meals. But there's never been, whether in the manifesto or before or since, any kind of surrounding dialogue or explanation or campaign about the issue more generally. The Corbyn-led party just hasn't wanted to go there. So why is there this long-standing failure, especially on the left, effectively to engage with the issue? And I'm sure we'll come back to this in the discussion. But here, very quickly, let me suggest 4 reasons. 1, the fear of the charge of hypocrisy. If you've been privately educated yourself, if you've sent your children to a private school, you'll be accused of being hypocritical if you actually want to change the system. And it's a very real fear. And I think it's inhibited not just politicians, it's inhibited the media. It certainly applies to the Guardian newspaper, all sorts of things. We can talk about that later. Secondly, the point, the in some ways valid point, but only up to a point, that educational and voters' priorities lie elsewhere. After all, we're only talking about a system that educates 7%. So at any one time, there's going to be some issue affecting the 93% in state schools that takes priority. And so at the moment, for example, the recruitment of teachers and resources generally. I mean, the state sector is absolutely strapped at the moment for resources. And we're talking about 93% of the population. So at any one time, it never seems, the private school issue, never seems the most important issue around. Thirdly, this is slightly my own pet theory, but I think sometimes on the left, there's anxiety that if you go on about the private school problem, you are somehow implicitly denigrating the state system. And I think that's an irrational anxiety, but I think it's there. But I am often struck when I've talked with state school teachers about it, how on the whole they're not that much interested in the private school question. They're getting on, obviously, with their own lives, their own jobs, and so on. But I think there is that implicit denigration anxiety. And finally, as I mentioned with Crossland, fatalism. the sense that there are such powerful vested interests involved, the sense that it's all too difficult, it's all too invidious, and I think that plays a part too. But I'm sure we'll come back to that in discussion. Meanwhile, Francis, what's to be done? Give us some practical and achievable thoughts.
I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Let's move away from the cartoon and just leave this slide up for a while. We've done our own thinking about options for reform, building on other people's ideas that have been bubbling under in discussion over the last 10 or 15 years. And broadly speaking, if you want to reform the private schools and the private school system, you can think of the proposals that have been offered in two categories. One set, in a sense, finds ways of curtailing the demand, persuading parents not to go for private schools for one way or another. And another set involves some kind of integrating of the supply of education, integrating the two sectors, the private sector and the state sector, in some way, whether partial or total or whatever. So I think it's quite a good way of thinking about the various proposals and how they might work or might not work. And I'm going to start with the curtailing of demand. First of all, there's this phrase, contextual admissions. Contextual admissions to where? To university. To university. And some of you, particularly in a place like this, will be aware of exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about proposals that have been around for a number of years to increase access to lower income families to universities. And they come in a number of forms, but perhaps the commonest form is some kind of differential offer. That if your circumstances are in some way disadvantaged through low income, then some universities have been offering differentially lower offers, perhaps 2 A's and a B to an A-level candidate rather than 3 A's. Usually just a marginal difference of 1 grade, sometimes maybe 2 grades, exceptionally 3. Alternatively, quotas. You could conceive of quotas sometimes being proposed extremely. I've seen someone saying, well, there are 7% of children going to private school, only 7% of places in Oxford and Cambridge should be available for privately educated people. That would be pretty drastic, considering they occupy about 42% at the moment. Whatever, contextual admissions are here to stay in some form or another, because the access agenda of the government and of all recent governments is serious and possibly getting more and more serious. And although mainly the criterion for getting contextual admissions is to do with things like have you spent time in a care home and so on and so forth, occasionally whether you've been to a private school or a state school is taken into account. And there's a very interesting example going on in Oxford at the moment where Lady Margaret Hall has an access year in which students are admitted for a preliminary year, as it were, and given intensive tuition, and they continue on to become first-year undergraduates. Now, to get into that access year, you had to fulfill certain criteria, one of which is to never have set foot inside a private school. Well, that's just an example, but it seems to me that if there were an intensification of this contextual admissions, it would be perfectly feasible to increase the role of the school type that you went to in the criterion used. The effects are difficult to judge, it has to be admitted there. The effects are difficult to judge. Some parents might be really put off. They say, well, I'm not going to spend whatever it is, an average fee of over £17,000 a year to send my child to school if that child's going to be disadvantaged when they're trying to get into university. Other people might not worry about it so much. So that's contextual admissions. It seems to me a feasible thing which could be looked in more. We haven't got detailed proposals for that, but it seems to be something which is working for certain purposes at the moment and is likely to get more intense in the future. The second proposal is basically to up the cost of it. And we saw a proposal in the Labour manifesto at the last election, which was to put VAT on school fees, which would add whatever the VAT percentage rate is on school fees. And of course that would diminish the demand a bit. Anyone knows about price elasticity of demand? Any economists in the room? I don't know, but we are at the LSE. But if you push the price up, the demand will go down. But actually the estimates to the price elasticity of demand are not very high, so that even a 15 or 20% increase in price doesn't actually reduce the amount of children going to private school very much. A slightly more extreme version of this was proposed by Lord Adonis in the House of Lords only last December. No, sorry, now not last December, December before last, in the House of Lords, which was to propose what he called an educational opportunity tax, which he was going to make at 25%. So that would have put a higher price on the fees. And so certainly that would reduce the demand for private schooling, and we calculated perhaps 40,000 pupils would switch from the private sector to the state sector. But that's still less than 10% of the population, the child population of private schools. So it makes an effect, a significant effect, that would not be a game changer. Some schools would undoubtedly close or switch to the state sector. More interesting, perhaps, are the proposals around, which we've called crossing the tracks, proposals to integrate the schools to some extent or another. And here I think it's important to distinguish between proposals where the schools retain their own private control over all the admissions and expulsions from the school, and other proposals, which I'll come to in a moment, where there is some form of social control over admissions, whether it's the central government or more likely local government controls the criteria for admission to those places in the private schools. So first let me tell you about the Sutton Trust Open Access Scheme. This was a proposal by Peter Lample, who's the director and the main benefactor of the Sutton Trust. He got the agreement of 90 of the most prominent private day schools only, that they would open up access to their schools to completely open on academic merit. And if you got in that school on academic merit, then the funds would be provided to get you to go to there. And he envisaged that perhaps 30% of the children in those schools would be funded by the state up to a certain amount. Perhaps another 30 or 40% would be mixed funded by the state and the schools themselves, and the final 30% would be all privately funded. A kind of version you might think of the old direct grant grammar schools, but there are significant differences. So means-free, openly academically competitive, very selective. Of course, you can immediately hear comprehensive school enthusiasts saying that that would have the tendency to cream off the brightest children from the local neighbourhood, demoralise the schools in the neighbourhood, and so on and so forth, for which there are responses from the Sutton Trust. They say, well, it's too small, it wouldn't make that much difference. To which I say, well, if it's too small, then it's not going to make much difference and solve our problem at all. There's an even smaller scheme involved, proposed by the Independent Schools Scheme, the Independent Schools Council, proposed in their manifesto, in which they're going to take 10,000 students and put them in private schools, 10,000 state school students from low-income families and put them in state schools. And the government is going to fund them according to the same rate they would fund children in the state sector. So in other words, it wouldn't cost the state anything. So then they would make up the additional funds needed to educate them in the private school from their own funding. So they call it a joint funding model. And they're very proud of it, but it's much, much, much too small. It would cover perhaps 2% of private school students. And the extra money that would be needed for them would really, they could just take it out of their bursary funds and still have money to spare for their bursaries. So the problem with that is it's just far too small. The proposal that we're more enamoured with is something we've called a fair access scheme, where not only would all the schools be obliged to take a proportion, we suggest initially 33% of children from the state sector, but that they would have to admit those pupils according to something like the school's admissions code. Anyone who knows about schools will know there's a thing called the school's admissions code, which is not perfect, but nonetheless determines the criteria for admission to schools in any particular area. And we think that the private schools taking those children to those 33% of places would have to conform to that. Whether it would stay at 33% or might even start lower than that, we envisage too that it would increase over time. But it would be introduced gradually. We recognise that there are different skills involved in teaching in a private school and in a state school. We wouldn't suddenly want to change the composition overnight. But we feel that a 33% initial intake, say for the first year of the school, and then building it up, would, in the end, be a game changer. It would start to change the social composition of the school. It wouldn't be like just a few working class kids in the school struggling to find their place amongst all the toffs. 33% would change the dynamics of the school. So that's perhaps one of the schemes that we proposed, which we're perhaps most enamoured of and would be anxious and we'd be very willing to have some discussion of. Before I finish, though, I want to mention a few things we've looked at in some detail and we think won't work. And I might disappoint some of you by suggesting that removing the charitable status of the schools won't be enough. It won't work. It's not that we're against removing the charitable status of private schools or making the schools more responsible to their charitable status than they are at the moment. It's just that actually, when you look at the numbers, it's not worth all that much to them compared to the enormous revenues that they have. Indeed, not all schools are charities. Lots of schools decide not to be charities. It's simply not worth the effort and the bother in terms of what they save. They save some. They, instead of paying 100% local business rates, they pay 20% business rates, for example. So it would be a sum of money, perhaps £100 million a year overall. In economic terms, in material terms, it's not an enormous big deal to remove charitable status. Even if you could, there are legal issues involved there. We do recognise, however, that it has tremendous symbolic value. So that, for example, when you walk down your local street and pass your private school and peer inside the gates and see all the affluent facilities and then go past the next bit, which is a state school, it probably is quite galling when you think, well, the first one is only paying 1/5 of its local business rates compared with the second one. It just seems unfair. And on the other hand, the private schools themselves relish their charitable status. They like to be known as charities. So, yes, it would have some impact, but we think primarily it would be symbolic, and we wouldn't like a reform strategy to rest on removing the charitable status and people think, oh, that's it, we've done it now, we've solved the problem. It would not. They would continue more or less as they are now. The second bullet point there is what we call the politics of hypocrisy, and it relates to something that David was saying a few moments ago. Essentially, this would be the strategy, I don't know whether it's fair to call it a strategy, but somehow expecting to persuade parents through some kind of moral crusade that they should ignore their desire for their children to succeed and do what's best for society and choose to send their children to state school, and somehow the private schools would wither away. The politics of hypocrisy is a dead-end strategy. It won't work in terms of changing anything, and we're very much opposed to that. And the third bullet point there, well, it got a bit convoluted there, but essentially it's the idea of whether private philanthropy and expanding the bursary system is a viable way forward. And indeed, this is something which is pushed by many well-meaning people within the private school sector itself. And there are some schools which have increased their bursary funds tremendously. Of course, they're the richer schools, led by Christ Hospital School, which has always had a very large bursary system. But in practice, this is not a goer. It's been calculated you probably have to raise for each school something like a 200 or 300 million pound fund in order to sustain a viable bursary scheme across all schools, which would seriously change the social composition of the schools. So even if there were some increase in the provision of bursaries from voluntary contributions from parents or alumni contributing to all these schools, so they have large sums of money invested and they can use the income to fund low-income families. It's never going to be enough, and it's not a viable proposition in the long run, or even in the short run. So, it's one thing to say that there are feasible schemes, and I do believe that there are feasible schemes amongst those that I've outlined in the previous slide. They need development. It's one thing to say that there are those schemes, but it's important to recognise, to see that there are going to be plenty of political obstacles, and David's now going to conclude our talk with some thoughts on those obstacles and possible ways forward.
Yeah, just to finish with, perhaps 6 quick thoughts to bear in mind about where we are now and where we might be going and so on. And the first thought is just a very sober, realistic thought. Don't forget the stark underlying reality of the situation. We have, on the one hand, systemic, fundamental unfairness. We come back to that ratio of resources, 3-to-1 between the private and the state sectors. It's a huge, huge difference. And on the other hand, we have a deep and determined vested interest in the form of the private schools, as they now are, often with very powerful allies in the city, in the press, in politics, and elsewhere. So they're not just going to curl up and die, as it were. Secondly, picking up on what Francis was just saying, if we're going to get anywhere with this, we need an inclusive, non-name-calling debate and conversation, not indulging in the politics of hypocrisy, not blaming parents. We live in the world as it is. We may or may not like that world, but that's the world we live in, and we all have to make our choices within that world. And if we're going to get anywhere with this question, we need to stand back, be less personal, less emotional, more dispassionate. In general, we just need to be absolutely unlike the current Brexit debate, really. Thirdly, inevitably, the Finnish example. Some of you will know about Finland. Finland, in effect, abolished fee-paying education in the early 1970s. And that's remained the case now for, almost half a century. And the results have been staggering. When the first, the PISA rankings in 2001 came out, there was Finland at the top of the global league table. And it's remained at or very near the top in the half century or so since the end of fee-paying education. And crucially, they had built up to this abolition in the early 70s by building, evolving gradually, but in a determined way, a consensus that this was the best way forward. And so there have been governments of different stripes, obviously in Finland since then, but they've all held to the policy. There hasn't been a reversal of policy. So consensus building, in other words. And if you're interested in the Finnish example, the other day I was on the podcast that Ed Miliband and Jeff Lloyd do. It's called Reasons to be Cheerful. And I was on episode 71 on the third rail issue, as Miliband called it. And I mention it because actually later in the programme I had a pre-recorded interview with Pasi Sahlberg, who's the great Finnish educational expert. And I've not met him, but he's clearly a wonderful man. And it's really worth listening to the 5 or 6 minutes or so of the interview with him about the Finnish example. It's strongly recommended. Fourthly, we have to learn from history. We have to learn from history. The lack of resolve, the failure to keep focused on the big picture as far as inequality is concerned. We have to learn the lessons of history. And it's been a sorry, sorry tale, really, over the last 70 or 80 years. Fifthly, it is an issue about society as well as education. It's about striking the right balance between liberty and equity. And we argue, that education is different in kind from other purchases. It's different in kind because unlike buying an expensive car, expensive house, expensive this, expensive that, it helps to determine and does so much to determine the shape of society. It's different in kind from other purchases. And secondly, we argue that the equity for the 93% outweighs liberty for the 7%. Equity for the 93% outweighs liberty for the 7%. These are difficult judgments. They need serious debate, but it's time to get that debate rolling. And sixthly, lastly, I come back to our populace poll. Now, you'll do the first slide, Francis, and that's the slide you've already seen with the landslide majority. I mean, in terms of people with an opinion one way or another, 75% reckon that it's unfair system we have now. 75% of those who have an opinion one way or the other. And this is about any kind of political campaign and the low profile on the whole of the issue in the media and so on. But I think they're remarkable and telling figures. But we also can drill down one other way with this populist poll, Francis, if you could do the other slide. And this is among insiders. And insiders we define as people who've been privately educated and or have sent their children to private school. And of course it's a slightly smaller majority, even so it's a striking majority. In other words, in terms of public opinion, there is actually something to work on. If opinion formers, if politicians had the nerve, had the vision, there is backing for doing something substantive and important about this. So very lastly of all, we'll leave you with a picture that a friend kindly took on Wimbledon Station last year. And in case some of you don't know Wimbledon, let me just put you in the picture. It's not an advertisement for the local comp. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay, so we're going to pass over to Dr. Luna Glucksberg now, who's going to give a 5-minute or so response to the book.
Thank you, Sam. Well, first of all, thank you, Francis and David, for the chance to read in the book. I really enjoyed it, and, well, it's great to be a discussant and to get the chance to ask the question. So, well, first of all, I really like the fact that you took something that, to me, seemed fairly black and white and made it into a nuanced and difficult and complicated subject. So I really appreciate that. My training as an anthropologist might have something to do with that, because if anyone in the room is an anthropologist, we all like to say, well, yes, but it's more complicated than that. So that really worked with me. I really liked it when you explained how education, as you were saying, is a different thing. It's not just any other luxury good. It's not a holiday. It's not a big car. And yet it seems that the core argument from one section of society is precisely that. I make lots of money and I'll spend it as I wish. And I think, so I'll make 3 very simple points, and this is one of them. And I think in a sense we need to be a little bit bold about demolishing that argument. Because not only does it not work in education, as you have very clearly explained, but if that's how we continue to think, we'll all burn with climate change. If I make enough money and I'll do as I please is the way we go, then I'll eat 4 steaks per day and drive an SUV. And who's to tell me otherwise? Now, luckily, it seems that things are changing a little bit at the moment, and we're starting to hopefully think differently. But it seems to me that that argument really needs to be demolished and put to bed once and for all. The freedom to do as you please, because, and also we know perfectly well that that is not true. There are plenty of things that are outside of the market. You cannot buy babies, you cannot buy organs, you cannot buy child prostitution. You're not allowed to own people, even though that was perfectly legal only a few years ago. So the fact that something is within or without the market and the freedom to do what we please, as we please with our money, is something that is culturally constructed and shifts, is not natural. So I think that's an argument that really needs to be grasped. Well, I think actually, because of lack of time, I'll skip to the third one. And that's something that I was very curious about, and was the fact that throughout the book, I couldn't really find much. Well, I really liked the way that you showed the Sutton Trust data, but I couldn't find anything about gender very much. So, yes, those people, those 7% that goes to the top schools, obviously manages to get access to incredible positions of power. But by digging a little bit into the numbers with the help of my colleague Aaron Reeves, it was quite remarkable to see that, for example, even though, broadly speaking, in that 7% of children, more or less 50% were girls. As you go up, as you move up, that percentage tends to fall. And so you find yourself, if I'm right, that with the HMC schools, which are kind of the upper tier,
Elite, yes.
you're already on 43% of girls and 57% of boys. And then if you move remarkably up into the Clarendon schools, then you have only 11% of girls. So I was wondering...
Well, I mean, partly it's a function of history, isn't it? Because the Clarendon schools, which were the kind of the great, inverted commas, public schools of the identified as such in the 19th century, but actually they were several centuries old for the most part by then. I mean, schools like Eton and Winchester go back to the Middle Ages. But at that point, of course, they were all male schools,
yes,
and would remain so until, I mean, I like Sam and indeed Francis, am privately educated. And at my school, Wellington, the autumn of 1969, which was my last term, the first girl arrived. Surrounded by 630 boys.
Well, it's funny you should say this because... Ooh. Well, we can still see. And we're back. By digging through the data a little bit, we seem to have found one girl, I believe she was at Winchester, or maybe, and it wasn't quite clear if that was an admin error, because it seemed impossible to think. I'm now feeling a little bit like I'm thinking about this one girl among 800 boys.
Winchester, I think I know the source of that, which is mid-60s Winchester.
Well,
there was a book called The Prefects.
It's the current data.
Oh,
if you go on gov.uk,
yes, sure.
yeah. So who knows?
But no, broadly speaking, I don't. We haven't viewed it as far. It's far more a class issue than a gender issue, I mean, obviously, historically, the most powerful private schools have tended to be the boys-only schools, because they're the schools, Eton par excellence, that have produced the prime ministers and so on. And we've only so far reached the second female prime minister in this country. We just have tended not to view it as a gender issue. And in terms of the sort of the literature on the subject, it's certainly the historical literature. It's tended to be stronger on the boys' schools than the girls' schools. But perhaps we perhaps we should have done a bit more on the girls' schools. But that said, we simply don't view it as essentially as a gender issue. I mean, there's a difference on the gender side that one of the chapters that Francis was primarily responsible for, to do, I'm right in saying, to do with the dividend, isn't it?
But it's interesting that the dividend is different for boys and girls, at least if you drill down to it enough, and it's sometimes difficult to be sure, but tended to be higher for the boys than the girls, in fact. At least for those who were going to school in the 1970s and 1980s. Whether it still is now, I don't have any evidence for it being different now, because that may well have changed. But it's clear to me, to my mind, that that's sort of associated with all the boys going into high-paid jobs in the financial and business sectors.
And
So it's reflecting kind of the gender divisions in society. And I think actually it's a fair point. I sort of I think we possibly should have said a little bit more about those things, but we didn't want to get diverted onto that, I suppose.
No, sorry, come on.
I suppose that was what I was trying to push a little bit, that these bastions of privilege are not just class-based, but they're also very white. Ethnicity is another point. They're very white and very male, which might be sort of obvious and by the by, but they're very much so.
A lot of Asian children in private schools.
Yes,
Sorry?
there are now.
A lot of Asian
Well,
children.
it would be interesting to see how Seamus Khan in the US makes the argument of how ethnicity seems to be changing in their top schools, but that's because foreign parents are buying into that. So class kind of changes the composition, but it's just, I suppose I wanted to push a little bit on the intersectional angle of the thing.
On your earlier remarks, I mean, I completely agree that we need to make robustly the argument about the limits of libertarianism. I mean, and you're absolutely right, it applies in all sorts of, walks of life. The analogy I've often thought is, you have a powerful car that can go at 140 miles an hour, but it's in the interests of society that you drive somewhat slower. But the frontier between the two, particularly between liberty and equity, are always, it's a shifting frontier. But it's in the wrong place at the moment, I think, so, in terms of this issue.
And the chair has just let me know that I have time for my second point. So I wasn't sure how you feel about, maybe I didn't quite understand, if your fair access idea would still be based on academic performance. Would it still be the brightest that get in?
We tried to remain very neutral on that we
Right.
would conform to the school's admissions code. However, that was constructed democratically by society. I mean, I think it would be disastrous that they were all made highly academically selective. But I wouldn't want to stand here and rule out any academic selection in those schools right from the start. Or maybe that's something which we could discuss, but I actually think the key thing is that it's socially determined what the access code should be. We didn't want to get drawn into a sideline of whether we were in favour of academic selection or not, and getting into the grammar school debate. So that was it.
But that any method of determining intake is essentially better than the depth of parental checkbook. Is our starting point.
Yes, I think that's I can see that. I think from it's interesting, and if I may sort of plug this new report that's come out of CASE, our Centre for Analysis of Social Equality here at the LSE, is this idea that actually they've accumulated a lot of data and shown that it's actually, even if you wanted to, separating a concern for poverty and a concern with inequality seems quite impossible. They seem to still go together. So in order to do something about poverty and the bottom, actually you need to work on inequality.
Interesting.
So that could be something to feed into the debate.
Yes.
And I think I've taken enough time.
Yeah.
So
Should we
open up, Sam?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lena. Okay, so we've got about 20 minutes for questions. I'm sure there's going to be lots. Here we go. So as we know, this is a sensitive topic, right? Just to say, just in the interest of time, and so we can get through lots of questions, if you could please keep these to questions, not comments or diatribes. Okay. Okay, so gentleman there in the blue jumper. We'll take 2 or 3 at a time. Gentleman here in the green jumper. And lady there in the black top in 5th.
Yes.
Yes, just there.
Yep.
Just here.
Yep.
Yes. Okay, do you want to, let's start, where did the first mic go?
In the corner.
Let's start
No,
with this
it was.
question.
Oh, yeah, and was that guy there?
Yeah. Just you.
Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you for an insightful, if not sobering, lecture. I'm a father of 2 young children, and as a father, you only want the best for your children, and that is the paradox, I think. Given the huge paradox here, given the huge advantages that private school confers against the huge inequality that it delivers, can I ask of the 2 professors with your own children, your own grandchildren, what decisions you made in educating your children?
I mean, in my case, I certainly didn't make a decision about my grandchild. In terms of our children, I have 3 children, and they all went to state grammars. I would have been entirely open if circumstances had been different to them going to a private school. The parental impulse to do the best for your child is very strong. We happened to move, and it wasn't part of our calculation, to an area that happened to have state grammars, and our 3 children happened to pass the 11 plus. But if they'd failed, if it hadn't worked out, who knows? So I really, both in a personal sense and in a kind of hopefully standing back sense, absolutely feel that condemning, criticising parents for choices they make as parents, even if those parents are Labour politicians, actually is stupid, actually, really.
If you don't mind, we'll take a couple more and then we'll keep answering. So yeah, if you want.
Hi, just quickly, what do you think of matching curriculums what do you think of matching curriculums in state schools and private schools?
Matching curriculums, and then
What that means,
yeah, just here,
They have
just
to
women there in the black top.
resources, I suppose. You go for that one, Francis.
Thank you. I'm from South Wales, and our greatest political export, Bevan, I think he said, talked about rising not out of your class but with it. And I'm just wondering how you think that, given the massive sort of social determinants of educational opportunity like health and housing, how that fits with your sort of notion of crossing the tracks when there's bound to be so many people left behind from this sort of potentially misguided concept of merit. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
You go first, and I'll do the second.
The question was on matching
Matching
curriculums. What do I think about having the same curriculum in private? Well, to the extent that most people do public exams, they're doing similar curriculums, not identical, I agree. But if there's a particular agenda called matching curriculums, I'm not sure the point of your question yet. So I apologise, I'm not fully understanding your question. But I mean, as it stands at the moment, with all the extra resources, there is a much extended curriculum available in a private school. Very many more options available. If you wanted to do an option which, is only one other person, maybe just a couple of you in the class, that's no problem because the resources are there in some of the more affluent schools. So the curriculum is broader in many of the private schools. It would be lovely if that were available to everybody, but we don't live in a utopia. But matching them completely, even under a fair access scheme, might not be that wouldn't be the first thing I would aim for.
On the Nye Bevan question, to do with effectively, I think you're asking really is, are we right to almost sort of fetishise as much as we do social mobility? Is sort of what you're asking, I think, and it's something which I find I'm very conflicted about, the whole question of social mobility. And indeed meritocracy, and I think you talked about merit. As you know, meritocracy, the word was popularised in 1958 by Michael Young, the rise of meritocracy, and he saw it essentially in a dystopian way. he saw he envisaged a future of self-perpetuating meritocratic elites, and eventually it would actually lead to a civil war. And he dated that civil war. He was looking ahead to 2034, so let's wait for that one. But on the other hand, he was not in favour of hereditary privilege, old boy network, and all the rest of it. So where does one get the balance right? And there's the whole kind of creaming off thing as well. I remember going to a lecture once by the historian and political commentator, the great Peter Hennessy, about Michael Young and meritocracy. And at the end, I asked him, so where do you... He kind of evaded saying exactly where he stood. So in the end, I said, well, are you actually, when it comes to in favour of meritocracy? And he paused and he answered, I think I'm in favour of a well-tempered meritocracy. And so not fetishising and not getting into that society gets into that state of mind where it regards academic talent, academic performance, and all the rest of it as the the greatest achievements of all. But actually, as Michael Young puts it in his book, the working man who grows roses in his garden, that's just as valuable as any kind of first-class degree or whatever. So it's a balance to be struck. But I do think that, call it equality of opportunity, is broadly speaking a good direction to be moving towards, and the private schools, the playing field is so grotesquely uneven, is so grotesquely sloping, that it's the last section of our book is called A Fair Shake, and that's looking forward. Hopefully, at the moment, it's a very unfair shake for 93% of our population. So I think we need to move in that direction, but to quote Hennessy, in a well-tempered way.
Okay, 3 more questions. Right at the back, lady in the black top, just in the second back row in the middle. Lady here in the orange jumper. And let's go with this gentleman here in the... What's that, sorry?
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. You touched on the choices of parents, but I wondered about the choices of private teachers. What do you think of the view that if we remove all fee-paying school, it will release a large amount of teachers into the state school system and bring up the overall quality? And also, do you have a version of your pie chart that surveyed whether private school teachers felt that private education was unfair?
Okay, so let's take a couple
Thanks,
more.
Sam, yes.
So, lady in the orange jumper, just this third one down here. This gentleman here in the orange jumper.
Yeah. Linked to that, I'm actually a teacher in a school with about 45% pupil premium, a state school, and I'm still unconvinced as to how any of your measures will improve the problems that my school faces and other schools like it face.
Okay, and then just one last question here.
Yeah, my last question is to Professor with the green trouser. It's about the selection at the university, because I come from a country where basically in order to get to the best university, the best school, they do a selection for medicine, for the best business schools, for engineer, and so on. So basically only who got the highest rank at the primary school, who is apparently the most intelligent about the quiz, get the access to this kind of private university. So do you think that can be in a way good in order to get the best people out of the education system, or it can be another source of inequality?
I didn't catch much of that.
Sorry, is there a question there? Yeah? Well, just to repeat the question, because I'm not sure we quite got
The question is if you think it's correct to have this kind of selection system for each university in order only to get the best student.
Did you get the question, Sam?
Sorry, one last time. We'll get it this time, I promise.
My point is that we basically discuss private school that is a kind of inequality. I mentioned a case of a country where basically they do selection in order to get to the university, that most of them are private university. Even if private university, you pay a fee based on your income, so sometimes you pay nothing. My point is that if this kind of system to always do a selection based on the marks of primary school or intelligent test, if not a form of inequality in a way.
Okay, so is any selection a form of inequality?
Okay, so shall I?
Yeah. Go for it.
On the private school teachers, the in the long term, the medium and long term, private school teachers would become, yes, more available for teaching in state schools. One would hope. Not all of them. Particularly in some of the more affluent private schools, there will be difficulties, I think. There will be teachers in those schools who wouldn't know very well how to control a class in inner city London, for example. So the transition would happen, but it would have to be slow, and not everyone would go with it. As for the views of the private school teachers themselves, I'm afraid I can't help you there. That we needed a sample of private school teachers as a representative sample across the country, so we couldn't identify the private school teachers in our sample, and in any case there wouldn't have been enough of them. Maybe I could then also turn to the question from over there. How would it help the state schools? And I wouldn't expect sudden salvation from the difficult position that state schools are in with diminishing funds since at least the last 5 years from reforms. This is a slow reform process that we're talking about. But I do think that in the long term there would be some benefits. In the long term there would be potentially there would be perhaps more prominence, more importance given to education when the education ministry isn't populated by people who have been privately educated, when many of the private school parents, private school children's parents, who are, many of them very passionate about education, if their energies were spent on trying to improve their local state schools, there could be benefits there. These are a little bit, well, they're real, they're not very specific. I can't say that it'll suddenly produce so many hundreds of millions of pounds, etc., that will go into the state sector. I don't think this is the way to improve the state sector in the next year. There's nothing, to me, put more money into them. They've been deprived of funds. But that's a separate issue from what we're talking about.
I mean, well, I don't think you're for the third one, Francis, but the Adonis thing, that proposal that Francis mentioned, the educational opportunity tax, did see a direct transfer of resources, hypothecated tax, about 25% of school fees going into specific areas of the state system.
2.5 billion.
A significant amount.
2.5 billion we calculated.
And I think also if it was a more level playing field, that would be a source of huge encouragement to the state system. I mean, polling evidence suggests that sixth form teachers in state schools underestimate the proportion of state school intake at Oxbridge. It's too low, but they actually underestimate what it is because of that sense of sort of fatalism. They're up against, it's the League Two team up against Man City kind of thing. And a more level playing field would make a significant difference in sort of aspiration, ambition, and so on. I think it would have a huge sort of psychological effect. And the Finnish example, I mean, basically what Sahlberg says about Finland is that if you have two parallel systems, you will not get excellence across the whole piece. And they've stopped having two parallel systems. They've achieved excellence across the whole piece. And I gather that the only real problem they have in Finnish state schools is that too often the teachers are away on sabbaticals doing PhDs. Would that was our biggest problem here.
Okay, time for a few more questions. Okay, gentleman here in the glasses, fourth row.
Selection inherently unequal.
Okay.
Is that what the question is? Well, that's what Sam said.
Right on the end of the row in a red T-shirt, about halfway up. And then right at the end, gentleman there on the right.
Universities.
Hi there. My name's Rory. I'm in the Inequalities program here at LSE, doing the MSc Inequalities. You've made a really strong case here for how private schools have the system of social reproduction that they support. And we saw it amongst the elites and cabinet and prime ministers, etc., that it produces. So therefore, isn't it very much part of the private schools' allure for a large numbers of the upper class is the social reproduction? And if we fill their ranks with the working class, won't they simply make that distinction and that social reproduction elsewhere? You also dangle the Finnish example in front of us. So then why today are you not arguing for the abolition of private schools rather than just fixing a broken system?
So
just
sorry, yes.
here. Yeah, we'll take two more quick ones. Yep.
Hello. Hi. David here, first year at LSE. I was just really interested about when you spoke about how people who go to private schools and later on, become people of significance and then suffer from this feeling of hypocrisy, and they feel like they can't stand up for state schools because they went to a private school. And I find it really interesting that an educational inequality is perpetuated by this psychological barrier. So my first kind of question is, can you tell us a little bit about how you overcame that psychological barrier as to come out and try and tackle this issue? And then I'm wondering if there's a broader way of trying to portray this to people who do hold positions of significance. How could they overcome this psychological barrier, and whether that will actually lead to a difference? Thanks.
Okay, last question.
Okay. Thank you for the discussion. I think it's been great. I just wondered whether you thought it was necessary to address what I think is one of the biggest changes happening at private schools right now, which is the huge influx of international students and the effect this has on pricing out for children of middle-class British students, the children of sort of teachers or doctors who used to be able to afford private schools and now can't, and instead sort of huge proportion of private schools are now like Chinese, Russians, Arabs, and I know stories of sort of children of dodgy Russians who pay their fees with a briefcase of cash, and I wondered sort of what you thought of this and what solutions there might be to this problem. If it is possible.
Okay, we've got just 2 minutes left, guys. Okay, so just have 1 minute each. Okay.
To be very quick, that why we're not advocating the abolition of the schools? Well, for a start, at least until Brexit happens, it would be against the European Convention of Human Rights and extremely difficult to bring about. Funnily enough, if Brexit happens, it will make it a teensy-weensy bit easier. Not that that makes me in favour of Brexit. To fully answer your question, I haven't got time. But I tried to say some things about why we were against full abolition in my talk. I think that if we do enough partial integration of the sectors, that it will do the job for reforming and opening things up a lot better.
I think also, historically, there's always been that tendency, not just to do with this issue, that the pursuit of the perfect leads to the failure to achieve the good. And we would really like to achieve the good. Perfect would be wonderful, but the good would be more than acceptable, given the historic failure to achieve anything over the last 70 or 80 years. So we're not apologetic about the argument that it's politically unrealistic to aim for abolition. I mean, anyone wants to try, good luck to them, but I think it's unrealistic.
Let me go next to the question from over there about the international students. And you're quite right to point out that we didn't say anything in our talk about international students. About 10%, it's a bit under 10% of private school children are now international. It's been growing over the last 20 years. But let's be under no illusion. It's not just because of international students that the price has been going up over the years. It's because of increasing inequality of wealth, and that very high fees are quite exclusionary and often probably purposefully exclusionary of people who don't have the money. And we shouldn't be completely dismissive of Russian oligarchs' children and so on, and Chinese children. There is a globalization going on in global elites of education, both at the school level and in university level, as we know. So yes, there are more, particularly in some areas of London, you see it. There are more international students, and some of the schools themselves are worried if they get too many international students, they change the dynamics, change the social movements of the school. There's been some excellent anthropological studies, actually, of that as well. But we think that's a soluble problem. I don't think it's something which, if we reform the system, we wouldn't kick out the international students. They bring in money. They're an export. And we really don't want a reform system to be derailed by issues like that. It was derailed by the issue of boarding in the 1960s, and the commission, which was given the job of trying to reform private schools, just ran into a black hole of problems of how they're going to deal with the boarding school problem. We certainly wouldn't like to have the same thing, how we're going to deal with the international students in the modern day and age. I don't think they can be blamed wholly for the high prices in these schools.
Okay.
And to finish with that terrific question from there about the psychological aspect, in which, if I heard the question correctly, you're really almost saying, so if one happens to have been privately educated, how does one, as it were, come out and criticise the system? And I have to say, at the ripe age of 67, having co-written this book with Francis, there are people, one or two friends or acquaintances, who are very much sort of emotionally bound up for a mixture of biographical reasons, autobiographical reasons, with the private school system. I'm nervous about mentioning the book to. And this is half a century after I left the wretched place. It's difficult. So I think the tone has got to be not accusatory, has got to be sympathetic and understanding. And as with anyone coming to, it's not easy. If you've had a very privileged education, you've had the education that 7% of people get and 93% of people don't. Undoubtedly, if you've achieved anything in your life, that will have played a significant part in that. And it's not easy admitting to oneself that whatever one's achieved in life has not been wholly down to one's own ability or hard work or whatever, but actually one got a very lucky draw from the pack of cards. And it's not easy admitting that to oneself, to other people and so on, but actually it tends to be that is the objective reality, but it's a mixture of things, including that circumstantial chance according to the parents to whom one was born and whether they had wealth or not. It's not easy, it's difficult terrain, and it needs sensitivity, but it also needs a degree of robustness, and above all, it needs kind of grown-upness and some kind of emotional maturity that we can have this debate without getting bogged down in wretched kind of personal circumstances, and one's always extrapolating from one's own situation and so on. We should be better than that. We should be capable of standing back and looking at the issue and working out what works best for us as a society and as an overall educational system.
Okay, on that note, I think we're going to have to leave it for the night, but if we can just say thank you.